On the early morning of the 29th of September, 1903, 35-year-old Eugene Griffith was making his way back home after a late-night shift in his hometown of Van Meter. Van Meter, being a small town in Iowa, was best known for its 250-foot deep coal mine, which was established in the early 19th century. Mine workers at the time, however, were being pushed to the brink, expected to work in dark and cramped conditions, and for so little pay, it was only a matter of time before the industry would see a pushback from its workers. And eventually in the early 1900s, we saw exactly that. Thousands of workers across the states would organize strikes, asking for fairer working conditions and higher wages. And due to these strikes, the coal mine in Van Meter could no longer keep up with the higher wage demands. And with rising production costs, the coal mine would ultimately end up closing down in the year of 1902. Griffith, on the other hand, had successfully started a business with his brother just 2 years earlier. Specializing in selling tools, the brothers quickly became well-respected members of the Van Meter community. Griffith was no stranger to working late. He had poured every drop of sweat into his business for the past 2 years, so heading home at around 1 AM was nothing out of the ordinary. Amidst his journey, however, Griffith noticed something unusual. On the roof of a local commercial building, he would look upon a strange light, and upon seeing it, he was left puzzled. Griffith had made this journey many times before, and being a local resident, he had memorized almost every corner of the town. Yet he couldn't recall ever seeing a light source on this specific roof before. Growing increasingly curious, he would decide to investigate. However, a few moments later, Griffith would come to a sudden stop. Because while walking towards the light, he had just witnessed it lift off the roof, move across the street, and come to rest on top of another building. Griffith was now in total shock, having witnessed something so unnatural, and with no explanation for how anything could move in such a manner. He stood there in total confusion. However, before he could get any closer to find out the source of the mystery, the light would begin to flicker before disappearing completely. A short while later, Griffith arrived home. Tired after a long day of work, he would climb into his bed. Despite being exhausted, Griffith could not stop thinking about the mysterious light he had encountered just moments before. He was positive that it wasn't a lamp or a lantern, and even if it was, how could it be lifted off the roof and travel across the street? In the early morning hours of the very next day, on the 30th of September, a man by the name of James Alcott was fast asleep in the back room of his office. Alcott was Van Meter's local town doctor, and as was common at the time, would use his own residence as a place where local patients could come for medical advice or treatment. While sleeping, Dr. Alcott would be awoken by a bright light. Alcott's first thought was that this was the light of a lamp and that a robbery was being attempted at his residence. In response, he would grab his gun and rush out of the building to confront the possible intruders. However, upon stepping out onto the damp street, Alcott would be confronted with a terrifying sight. As he looked towards the source of the light, Dr. Alcott noticed that standing directly behind it was a strange creature, which he described as being half man and half animal, with large bat-like wings. And protruding from the center of the creature's head was a blunt horn, which emitted a bright beaming light. Faced with such a terrifying sight, Alcott fired 5 shots from his gun directly at the creature. However, to his panic, not one of the shots appeared to have any effect. Feeling helpless and noticing that he had no way to defend himself, Dr. Alcott ran back into his office and immediately locked all doors and windows. With his gun still in hand, all he could do was pray that the strange beast would not pursue him and wait for the comfort of morning light. With the arrival of the sun, Dr. Alcott would share his frantic story with anyone who would listen. In response, the townsfolk were once again left in confusion. Many people in town relied on Dr. Alcott's help, not only for medical treatment, but also as a source for education when it came to treating illnesses or injuries. How could they dismiss his story as madness when the person telling it was a respected doctor, who the town trusted with the well-being of its residents? On the very next day, on the 1st of October, a man by the name of Clarence Dunn had just arrived at the Van Meter Bank. Dunn had recently taken position as the bank's cashier, and fitting the role well, Dunn was confident that this job would be exactly what he needed in order to move up the corporate ladder. On this particular day, however, Dunn was nervous. He had heard of the strange encounters witnessed by Griffith and Alcott, but Dunn was confident that the stories had become heavily over-exaggerated. Dunn wasn't superstitious, he was confident that the culprit were burglars. For a few hours after starting his shift, nothing would happen. Dunn would continue his daily duties, and eventually the strange stories would even leave his mind. At around 1 AM, however, Dunn would start to hear strange sounds. Before he could listen any closer, a bright beam of light would suddenly break through the bank's window and temporarily blind Dunn. The light would then move around the room, seemingly searching its surroundings. Dunn would later state that while the light was searching around the room, he would see a faint figure outside the window, and just like the accounts of Dr. Alcott, Dunn too claimed to see giant wings spread behind the mysterious light. In a sudden moment of panic, Dunn would fire his shotgun directly at the creature. The shot would shatter the glass window of the bank, and moments later, the mysterious light would disappear. Once dawn had broken, Dunn would arrange for a search party. But despite hours passing and the townsfolk pacing throughout the town, the search would yield no sightings of the creature. However, what Dunn would find during the search would confirm that his earlier sightings were no illusion. While scouting the area surrounding the bank, Dunn would discover multiple three-toed tracks imprinted in the damp, muddy ground. Many would consider Clarence Dunn to be one of the most reliable witnesses of the event. He had a high level of education and would even be later promoted to bank manager 32 years after the incident. Furthermore, Dunn would even be elected mayor of Van Meter in the year of 1947. On the evening of the 1st of October, the town would be covered by rain moving in from the north. On this evening, a man by the name of Otto White would be sleeping on the second floor of the local hardware and furniture store which he co-owned. White would be in a deep sleep, having just finished a hard day's work. However, his sleep would be interrupted by strange gasping sounds coming from outside his bedroom window. Being familiar with the stories told by Griffith, Alcott and Dunn, White's immediate response was to grab his rifle and approach his window to investigate. While looking out of his window, White was trying his best to adjust his vision to the glossy environment, and while peering through he would spot a figure sitting atop a nearby telephone pole. Upon the sighting, White would notice that the figure was too large to be a person or a bird, and immediately knew that the figure he was looking at had to be the creature that had been terrorizing Van Meter. Taking aim in a way that ensured he could not miss the shot, White would fire at the beast. The bullet appeared to have little to no effect. Instead, the creature seemed to awaken and turned its mysterious light directly towards White. After taking the shot, White would describe a foul stench being emitted from the creature, filling the air with such unpleasant odor that he recalled it being very difficult to breathe and maintain focus on the terrifying figure that was glaring towards him. During this commotion, a neighbor by the name of Sidney Gregg was suddenly awoken by the sound of a gunshot. Upon hearing the gunshot, Gregg would open his front door and peer outside to see whether someone was in trouble. While opening his door and directing his attention towards where he believed the shot had originated, Gregg's focus would immediately center on the macabre creature. He described seeing the creature descending the telephone pole and moving in a manner similar to that of a parrot and possessing a large beak. The creature would climb down from the pole and perch down onto the rain-soaked streets, where Gregg described it as standing around 8 feet tall and emitting a foul stench which correlated with the description given by White. This encounter, however, would be interrupted by a scheduled train running through the local train station. Gregg would see the creature become startled upon hearing the loud sounds of the approaching train, before suddenly running on all four limbs, and at the end of its gallop, it extended its wings and would disappear into the sky. The following day, Van Meter would erupt into a frenzy. For the town, the sightings had now officially moved beyond stories that children would exaggerate to scare one another and had become a real and frightening possibility. In the early morning hours of the 3rd of October, near the town's abandoned coal mine, James Platt Jr. was working as an operations manager at the local tile and brick factory. Platt had come from a family with long-standing connections to the local coal mining industry. However, after the mines had shut down in the year of 1902 due to the strikes, his family had moved their operations to the nearby brick factory. Platt had begun his shift like any other day. His attention, however, would be drawn away from his daily tasks when he began hearing strange sounds coming from the entrance of the nearby coal mine. Upon hearing these sounds, Platt was confused. He knew that the mine had been closed for more than a year and dismissed the sounds as nothing more than possible wild animals. As time passed, however, Platt could no longer ignore the noises as they would grow louder and louder, and he would finally decide to investigate. He would walk towards the entrance of the mine, and as he closed the distance, the mysterious noises would become increasingly unsettling. Upon reaching the mine's entrance, and curious about what was causing the unsettling sounds, Platt would try his best to peer inside the entrance, but initially he couldn't see anything through the dark shadows. But then as his eyes adjusted to the dark, he would notice a figure emerging from within. However, before he could leave and run towards the town to break the news to the townsfolk, Platt would freeze, as from within the coal mine he would spot a small glow of light emerging from within, and from behind the light a smaller creature followed. Platt had barely any time to gather his thoughts before both creatures would eventually take to the sky. Although Platt was taken off guard by the sighting of the second creature, a sense of duty would rush over him as he realized he had possibly found a way to end the strange events. Following this discovery, Platt rushed towards the town and convinced the others to form a hunting party. Armed with guns and dressed in raincoats, the residents planned to ambush the creatures inside their supposed lair. Platt and the men, however, would waste no time as they planned to march towards the mine that very night. The men would then kiss their families goodbye, instruct the townsfolk to leave their lights on, and venture into the cold, wet night where they gathered around the entrance of the mine and waited. For much of the night, the hunting party remained in position. Platt and his men at this point were beginning to think that their hunt would end in failure as hours passed by. However, at around 6 AM, shadows would loom over the gang as the 8-foot creature appeared to land near the entrance of the mine, followed by the smaller creature that had been spotted only hours earlier. Platt and his men jumped and raised their weapons as they fired a barrage of gunshots. As the sound of gunfire filled the air, the creatures responded with loud unearthly noises and released the same foul odor described by previous witnesses. However, despite the countless number of ammo fired at both the beasts, the two creatures showed no injury or care, as they simply and calmly descended back into the mine. At this response, the crowd would fall deathly silent. Only moments earlier, the men had felt like hunters pursuing their target. After the encounter, however, a new feeling overcame them: fear. Platt and his men realized that the weapons appeared to be useless. They had just fired enough rounds to bring down multiple elephants, but it all seemed useless, and with the mine reaching a depth of 250 feet, no one would be brave enough to follow the two creatures underground. Instead, the hunters would slowly return to Van Meter. Once again, panic would spread throughout the town as the residents would hear of the failed attempt to stop the creatures, and many would begin to believe that there would be no end to the sightings. However, the town would come together and a sense of relief would arrive when it was decided that a group would be sent to seal the entrance of the mine. Using whatever heavy metal and debris they could find, the townspeople successfully barricaded the entrance, leaving the creatures trapped below, or so they hoped. Many questions, however, remained unanswered. Did the creatures manage to leave the mine before the entrance was sealed? Could the remains of these mysterious beings still exist deep underground? And were these creatures even affected by time? More than a century later, the Van Meter visitor remains one of America's most enduring mysteries. While many dismiss the story as folklore or mass hysteria, it is difficult to ignore the sheer number of eyewitness accounts. Ultimately, as with any unsolved mystery, the conclusion you reach is entirely your own.